Perfect. So welcome to today's INTO Suffolk webinar. Our theme for our Wednesday webinar series today is Understanding U.S. Healthcare and Immunization Requirements. So this is a really interesting topic because it relates to how you, our students, can get access to doctors, medication, and also understanding something called U.S. health insurance, which is required for all Suffolk students. So what I'll be talking about today specifically is some very important reminders for our new INTO Suffolk students. And these are reminders that have specific deadlines as well. I'll also be talking about what US healthcare is. So specifically diving deeper into health insurance, common terms, what a health insurance ID card looks like, and more. I'll also be talking specifically about the Suffolk student health insurance, which is what you all will have when you study at Suffolk. So who you can speak to and what services are offered. Lastly, I'll be talking about what's called immunization requirements. And this is something that every student needs to complete before classes begin. And as I said earlier, we have plenty of time at the end of today's session for questions and answers. And if you have any questions while I'm presenting, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask, or you can type them in the chat. So let's get started. So because this is a Wednesday webinar series, which is designed to prepare you before orientation, we do have some orientation trivia facts. If you are a student that is planning on attending all of these webinars, then you are going to have some extra information that you'll be using during our orientation trivia competition, which happens on the last day of orientation. So please remember these facts and answers, because you may see them again during that competition. But our first orientation trivia fact is, does anyone know what the Freedom Trail is? And you're welcome to type in the chat if you have a guess. All of these trivia questions are related to the student experience and what it's like to live in Boston. Any good guesses about the Freedom Trail? Yes, that is correct. So the Freedom Trail, someone guessed it correctly. It is an actual physical trail in the city of Boston that takes you to 16 important historical landmarks for US history. All new students will actually have an opportunity to walk this trail when you come to Boston for your classes. It'll be one of our student events and activities, and it'll be free. But let's move forward and talk about some INTO Suffolk reminders. So these reminders are bits of information that I'll be sharing, but I'll also make sure to share this presentation with all of you here today at the end of the webinar. So if you are trying to frantically write down these reminders, don't worry, you'll receive a copy of the PowerPoint.
Sophie, just a quick question. Are you presenting a PowerPoint right now? Because we see your desktop.
Oh, never mind. Then let's try that again. Yes, I am. Thanks, Tim.
Yep.
This might make more sense for students then. You see my beautiful desktop, but now
yes.
do you see PowerPoint? Oh,
yep.
Perfect. I had all these beautiful pictures too.
The charts were pretty.
Thanks, Tim. So my first reminder is we have a Wednesday webinar series, and you're attending one right now, but every Wednesday starting at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll have a different topic focused on making sure that you're prepared for your student experience here at Suffolk University. So next week's presentations, we have a special webinar in Chinese that's designed to prepare our Chinese speaking students with what to expect at Suffolk University. This presentation will be in Mandarin. We also have this is one of my favorite ones, a really great presentation for students that are curious about what the academic experience is going to look like. So it's called Strategies for Academic Success in the US, and you're actually going to be meeting your academic advisor. So she'll be presenting some great resources and tips about how to be prepared for being an amazing student and also what your first day as a Suffolk student will look like. We also have presentations about how to get involved, preparing for orientation, living on campus, and of course, getting ready for your move from your home to Boston. So I look forward to seeing you all next Wednesday for our Wednesday webinar series. Some other important reminders include some orientation dates and deadlines. So as a reminder, INTO Suffolk orientation is required for all new students. Next week, you're going to receive an email with a link to our online orientation course. Asynchronous means that you can complete this on your own time. It is not going to be like a webinar where there's a live speaker. It'll be a website where you'll be able to look at important information such as how to order your textbooks, the math placement test exam. You'll also be able to see photos if your teacher is there. So please take enough time. Don't wait till the last minute. But starting next week, you'll be able to go through this online orientation course and review the materials there. Our live orientation, so this is orientation where you're going to see me in person or over Zoom, that begins August 31st. So I look forward to meeting you in person then. And that orientation will begin on that Tuesday, August 31st. And then the last orientation day will be that Friday. So make sure that you are in Boston before the first day of orientation. We recommend students arrive August 30th. Speaking of arrivals, if you have already booked your flights into Boston, it is important that you complete our airport arrivals form. This form lets us, so the INTO Suffolk team, know when you're flying in, what flight you're on, the time, the date. And if you're living on campus in one of our resident halls, we'll actually be able to book you a free airport transfer from Boston Logan Airport to your resident hall front door. In order to get access to this airport transportation service, you must complete our airport arrival survey. And honestly, it takes less than 5 minutes. It's so short, but it's so important for our team. And of course, as you get ready to begin your studies, if you want to meet other INTO Suffolk and Suffolk University students, you're welcome to connect with students online through our TAP Ambassador portal. So if you have questions about what are things maybe I should pack, or I'm really interested in these specific student clubs, and I see on the website that you're also part of this club, do you have any recommendations for me? I highly recommend getting to know your peers before classes begin. In fact, you're going to be able to meet one of our TAP student ambassadors at our Wednesday webinar in 2 weeks. So you will be able to meet some other students before classes begin. So those are my important reminders. And now let's dive deeper into the topic of today's webinar, which is US healthcare and health insurance. So the reason why we have a whole webinar on this topic is because healthcare is complex in the US, meaning it's sometimes hard to understand, even for Americans, and it's also very expensive. So it's very important that you understand what health insurance is and how it relates to you as a student. So this slide, as I said earlier, healthcare is expensive in the US. So healthcare is if you need to see a doctor, if you get hurt, if you're not feeling well, those services related to your health are part of our healthcare system. As a student, you will have what's called health insurance. And health insurance covers most of the costs of seeing a doctor. It's very important that you have health insurance because accidents or medical conditions can happen at any time. For example, you could be playing football outside with friends, out in the Boston Commons, and you might fall and hurt your leg, and you have to go get a cast, something like this. That costs money in the US. If you have health insurance, which you will have, that price is much, much cheaper. So we talk about health insurance because I want you to understand how it applies to you and how you can use your health insurance knowledge if you were to get sick. It's also important to have health insurance so you know which doctors you can go to, which specialists you might need to schedule appointments with. It's also important because if you are currently taking medication for an illness or for preventative medication, we want to make sure that you can still access that medication in the US. So health insurance is helpful in finding doctors and pharmacies where you can still get access to those same medical services. So as I mentioned before, everyone in Massachusetts is required to have health insurance by law. So all students will have the Suffolk Health Insurance Plan. If you have your own health insurance and you want to waive the Suffolk Student Health Insurance Plan, please email us directly. I've included our email in this slide. We do offer what's called a health insurance waiver. If you are wanting to request this waiver, you must make this request and complete the waiver before orientation begins. So there is a deadline that you have to manage. But I will say that this presentation will focus on the benefits that you have under the Suffolk Health Insurance Plan specifically. So this is, I think, the most complex slide of the entire presentation. And it is what I call healthcare terms. So if you are wanting to go find a local doctor in Boston, these are some terms that are really helpful to know of and to understand. And so I'm going to go through them bullet point by bullet point. In the US, there's always a cost if you want to see a doctor. I know in some other countries it is free, which is, I think, a great price. But in the US, there's always some sort of money that needs to be paid. That payment is called a co-payment or co-pay. This is how much money it will cost you to see a doctor in the United States. It is what's called a flat fee you pay every time you go to the doctor or fill a prescription. Sometimes the co-payment could be as low as $10 to see a doctor. For other insurance companies, it could be as much as $50 every time you want to see a doctor, but it's usually a smaller dollar amount. And I'll tell you how you can find out how much your copay is later in today's presentation. So once again, if you're going to see a doctor, there's most likely a copay that you will be responsible for. The next term is called a deductible. A deductible is an amount you owe during a coverage period. So that's usually for 1 calendar year. And this covers your healthcare services before your plan begins to pay. On the Suffolk Student Health Insurance, your deductible is $0 if you're in network. So you don't have to worry about this that much. But let's say that you're traveling to California for vacation during spring break and you rent a bicycle and you fall and you break your arm and you have to go to the doctor. You might have to find medical services, and that might cost more money because you are now out of Boston. So you might be seeing a doctor that is not in your network. So the deductible is how much money that you are responsible for paying before your insurance will cover the rest. And I'll provide examples of this later, do not worry. So copay and deductible are 2 terms that relate to how you can budget if you have maybe an ongoing medical condition as well. So how much money you have to put aside if you're going to see a doctor. The last 2 terms are preferred provider or in-network provider and out-of-network provider. A preferred provider, it's a tongue twister, is when a doctor, hospital, or other provider, and a provider is, for example, a doctor or a specialist or a hospital. So a provider is someone that provides medical services. It's when these providers accept your health insurance plan. So if they accept the Suffolk Health Insurance Plan, they are considered in your health insurance network. And it is so much cheaper to go see a doctor if they are in network. If you, for example, were to go to our Suffolk Student Counseling, Health and Wellness Services and you saw a nurse there, it will cost you $0 because they are in network. So much more affordable. However, if you are, out of network, this means when you go to a doctor or a provider who does not take your health insurance plan, then it is much more expensive. So when you are looking to find a local doctor in Boston, it's very important that you look for a doctor that's considered in your network. And actually, if you're thinking, gosh, I'm still so confused, don't worry. You can schedule an appointment with me or anyone on my team, and we'll be able to help you find doctors that are in your network. So we'll talk a lot more about this during orientation that happens in August. Okay, so I know that was a lot of very detailed information. So we are going to give you another opportunity to showcase your knowledge. We have another orientation trivia fact. So because we're talking about health and wellness today, our question is a true or false question. Is alcohol allowed at Suffolk University? True or false? Please take your best guess in the chat. Oh, I see a guess. The correct answer is false. So alcohol is not allowed on campus. So please be mindful of that when you come to our school. Another health and wellness trivia fact is the statement, marijuana is allowed at Suffolk University. True or false? Oh, y'all are fast. I see so many guesses in the chat, and I'm so impressed with your knowledge. You are correct. It is false. Marijuana is also not allowed at Suffolk University. So I'll also be sharing some more health and wellness facts with our health insurance information in today's presentation. And remember these trivia facts, because we'll be asking them again during our trivia competition. So I briefly talked about what health insurance is in the United States, but now we're going to speak specifically about your Suffolk student health insurance. And remember, all students will have this exact same insurance. So the first question is, who is the Suffolk student health insurance provider? And that is a company called Blue Cross Blue Shield. And this is what their logo looks like. They are nationwide, so they're going to have a lot of doctors in their network across the United States, which is really helpful for you because that means you have a lot of doctors to choose who you want to see at a low cost. Blue Cross Blue Shield also has a phone number that you can call if you have questions about the insurance, your doctors, medication, if you're not feeling well. And they also have free language and translation services available. So if you have a medical condition and you don't know the English words to describe the condition and how you're feeling, don't worry, they have hundreds of languages available for you to use as a translation service. If you're ever curious about the Blue Cross Blue Shield, once again, you can always schedule a meeting with any of the INTO Suffolk staff in our center, and we could also jump on a Zoom call if that's preferable. But remember, the Suffolk Student Health Insurance Provider is an organization called Blue Cross Blue Shield. And I wanted to include some specific costs, so the pricing for Suffolk Student Health Insurance. So we've already talked about the copay, and that once again is that set flat fee. So it's, let's say for some people it might be $10 to see a doctor. Anytime you go to the doctor, you'll always pay that $10. The second cost I wanted to discuss is the deductible. So this is how much money, once again, you owe to get access to healthcare services before your health insurance starts paying for those costs. If you see someone in network, and once again, there are hundreds of in-network doctors, especially in Boston, it will cost you $0. So that's the cheapest amount. You don't have to pay anything extra beyond your copay to see a doctor in network. If you find a doctor out of network, you owe the first $250 for that calendar year. So this is why I always tell students, when you find your local doctor, make sure to find a local doctor that is in network, because it is no extra cost for you. There is another important health insurance term called out-of-pocket limit. And this is the most that you will pay out of your own pocket before health insurance covers 100% of all following medical costs. So the most that you will ever pay out of your own pocket for medical and health services will be $4,500. It is extremely rare for students to ever pay this much money for medical services. This might happen if you are really, really sick and are hospitalized for multiple days in a row, but majority of the students that I work with have never had to pay this much money out of pocket for health services. So once again, as a student with Suffolk Student Health Insurance, my key takeaways for you are: find a doctor that is in network, because it is no additional cost for you to see them beyond that copay. And you're probably wondering, well, okay, what are the services that are covered by Suffolk Student Health Insurance? There is a huge list that exists of all the medical services that you can take advantage of using the Suffolk Health Insurance. Some of them, I couldn't fit them all on this slide, include getting a routine physical. So that's your blood work, your height, your weight, making sure that you're healthy. That happens a minimum of one time a year, and that is free. You also are able to get your eyes, your vision checked. If you are someone where your body is twisted or misaligned, you can go to a chiropractor, someone who cracks joints and moves your bones, and that's covered in your health insurance. So it's a very small cost to pay. You will also have access to x-rays and lab tests. If you're interested in acupuncture, you also can schedule acupuncture visits. Your health insurance will also cover surgery. And if you have to be put under so that you are not awake during the surgery itself. It will also cover prescription drugs. And then there's also something called a wellness participation program reimbursement. So your health insurance will actually pay you, yes, it will pay you up to $150 if you are able to complete their wellness participation program. They'll also pay you, yes, you will get money if you complete their weight loss reimbursement program. So you as a student, just for having healthy habits, can earn up to $300 from your health insurance by participating in these programs. I also want to share, this is important, the Suffolk Health Insurance does not include dental or teeth coverage. Dental insurance coverage must be purchased separately. If you are interested in also having dental health insurance, please contact me. I'll be happy to send you information about how to sign up for dental coverage. And I'll provide my contact information at the end of today's presentation. So at this point, you're thinking, okay, I have this really great health insurance plan. I know I could see a doctor, I could see someone for my eyes, I could get glasses, but how do I actually access those services? And you'll access them through your health insurance card. And this is a physical card that you'll carry. So the card will look something like this. It'll have your name. It'll also have your plan name and ID number. So this is the number that's important. You don't have to memorize it, it's on the card. but that's how you'll get access to all of these services. We talked about copay. That's that set dollar amount you have to pay every time you see a doctor. It will actually include how much your copay is. So for this example, I know it's a little blurry, but the copay is $15. So this is how you'll know, once again, what your copay amount is. It also has additional costs. So let's say if you are really sick and you have to go to the emergency room or hospital, it will include how much that will cost on your card. And I think most important, it'll have a number to call if you have questions. And that's that same number that also offers free translation and language services. So you will actually get access to this health insurance card. If you're living in the US, you will actually get this card during our synchronous or live orientation that begins August 31st. So you'll actually get a physical copy of it as part of your orientation materials. However, if you are going to be living outside of the US for fall semester and taking classes online, you can access your card through this website. And because you're not in the US, you will not need the card in your possession, so you will receive it when you arrive into the United States. So once again, for students that are going to be in Boston this fall semester, you will get your health insurance card during our live orientation at the end of August. It is very important that you carry this card with you at all times. So take it and then put it immediately in your wallet, because you want to have it in case you need any sort of health services at any time. They'll typically ask for your health insurance card when you go to a hospital or see a doctor. I also wanted to share something that I think is so helpful for students, and that is our Suffolk Counseling, Health, and Wellness Department. This is our on-campus health clinic. So if you, let's say, are taking classes and all of a sudden at the end of class, you feel like your throat is uncomfortable and you have a cough, and you're like, I don't feel good, you can actually walk from class to our on-campus health clinic and see a nurse. And it is free, so there's no cost because of your health insurance. So our on-campus health clinic offers a lot of different services, and those include counseling services, medical appointments, immunizations. We'll talk more about immunization requirements in a minute, flu shots, contraceptive management, counseling and emergency contraceptions, that would be condoms, birth control, etc. Eating concerns, so like nutrition, and of course, COVID-19 vaccine support. So we will make sure if you have not yet been vaccinated, that you can get assistance from the school on scheduling your COVID-19 vaccine in the United States. Our Counseling, Health, and Wellness office is open during business hours, and they also have a phone number that you can call 24 hours, 7 days a week. If you are not in Boston, let's say you're studying in your home country, we have another service that would be a good fit for you, and that is called our My Student Support Program, or MySP. This is an app that you can download to your phone. In fact, any student can download this, and I recommend that all students have this app in your phone. And it actually, of course, has that language and translation support, but it is designed as a way that you could text, so you can chat, you can call, you can schedule a virtual meeting with a confidential, professionally trained counselor. Confidential means private. So if you are, let's say, struggling with culture shock, or you are thinking, God, I have not been sleeping well, I'm only getting 1 to 3 hours, what's going on? Maybe you're feeling really tired. Maybe you're feeling really depressed or sad. Maybe there's been a death in your family and you're just not sure how to manage those emotions. All of those feelings that you might be having are feelings that are normal for folks to have from some time or another. So what I recommend is that it's good to talk to someone who is a professional who can help you figure out next steps. And so this app is, once again, free. You can contact anyone anytime. So it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it is free, once again, for our Suffolk students. And you can download it on the App Store, Google Play, or Android. So the last topic of today's presentation is immunization requirements. So we've talked about INTO Suffolk reminders, we talked about US healthcare, what health insurance looks like, what Suffolk student health insurance looks like, and now we're going to talk about the Suffolk immunization requirements. So a big reminder is that our university requires that all students are to be vaccinated for COVID-19 by August 16th. Your vaccination card, so the proof that you've gotten your COVID-19 vaccine, must be in English. I recognize that in many countries it may not be in English, so an English translation is accepted as well. If you are not able to get vaccinated for COVID-19 by the deadline of August 16th, then we have an option for you. It's called our INTO Early Welcome Program. It is designed for students who are not able to get vaccinated in their home country. And you will actually be arriving into the United States earlier to get your COVID-19 vaccine in Boston. As you can see, I highlighted this in red, but the deadline to register for this program is actually tomorrow, so it's July 15th. If you're at all interested in this program, please contact us at the end of today's presentation. I'd be happy to send you more information about our INTO Early Welcome program. With our COVID-19 vaccine requirement, we do have other immunization requirements. In fact, there's a whole list on the Suffolk University website. We've included that link in this presentation, which I'll be sharing with you after today's webinar has ended. But all students are required to upload their immunization records to what's called the Student Suffolk Health Portal before classes begin. All of your immunization records must be in English. And this is because our nurses do not speak a lot of other languages besides English. And so if your documentation maybe is in Russian or in Vietnamese, please make sure that you get it translated before uploading those documents to the Suffolk Student Health Portal. Once you have your immunization records translated into English and all ready to go, this is how you'll upload them. So you'll log in to the Student Health Portal. This is what it will look like, the screen. You will log in using your Suffolk University credentials. So that's your Suffolk username and password. It's the same username and password that you received, I believe, last week in your email. It's going to be very similar to your Suffolk student email as well. So you'll have that memorized, I know, before classes begin. But you'll log in using your Suffolk University credentials. And what you'll do next is you'll see this button called immunization, and you will click immunization. It will have important information about what the documentation needs to include. And of course, you have it all translated into English, and you will then upload your immunization record. There are going to be what's called required immunizations. For example, the COVID-19 vaccine is a required immunization. All students must have it. And there's also some recommended ones as well, such as the flu shot that you can get. Once you've uploaded your documentation, make sure that you include which COVID-19 vaccine you have received. There'll be a section for that in step 4. And then most important, once the documentation has been uploaded, make sure to click submit. That is all you have to do. If you wanted confirmation that your immunization record was properly uploaded, you can always contact us and we'll be happy to confirm that. Once again, all students are required to submit their immunization records in English before classes begin. So if you haven't done so already, please make sure that you start collecting that paperwork now and uploading it as soon as you are able to. Oh, so it's a lot of very important health and wellness information. So we're going to end it on our final orientation trivia fact. Hopefully this is an easy one for you all, but this is another true or false question. Is Boston the capital of Massachusetts? Does anyone know? Oh, someone was so fast. Oh, and someone knows their US states and capitals. And the correct answer is true. So this is a fun fact. Suffolk University and INTO Suffolk are located in the city of Boston, which is the capital of the state of Massachusetts. So now when you say I'm flying into Boston, know that it is the capital of the state and also the most dense, the most people live there. It's also the best city in the state of Massachusetts. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation today, we do have plenty of time for questions. I've also included our INTO Suffolk email. So if you have questions that you feel more comfortable asking privately, please email us. I'm always happy to speak with students one-on-one over a video call before orientation begins. But are there any questions that folks have right now that I could help answer?
I have a question, Sophie.
Ask away.
There may be some students on here that are direct. And I'm just wondering, is the MySP for everyone across the campus or only INTO students?
So MySP is once again that free app that students can download onto their cell phones that gives you access to private counseling services. It is available for all Suffolk students. So any student, whether you're a business student, an INTO Suffolk student, a grad or undergrad, anyone can download it. And you can actually download it today if you wanted.
And they could use it in their home countries, right?
Yes, you can use it in your home country. You could also use it in Boston.
Thank you.
Of course, good question. Go back to, I know it's a lot of screens at once. We're going to go back to our email. I'm actually going to do this as well.